New York is carrying more than 3 million immigrants. Its shelter system has already absorbed tens of thousands of asylum seekers, and now in 2026, the crisis is entering a far more dangerous phase. This is no longer just about crowded shelters or overwhelmed city budgets. It's about federal crackdowns, rising IC arrests, legal battles, and a city being pushed toward a breaking point. And the most unsettling part, what's happening now could reshape not only New York's future, but the future of immigration policy across America. For years, New York tried to present itself as a place of refuge, a city strong enough, compassionate enough, and rich enough to handle the pressure. But in 2026, that image is being tested like never before. Airport threats, deportation fears, shrinking resources, and growing political tension are creating a storm that feels bigger than anything the city expected. Behind every headline is a deeper question. Can New York still protect the people who came here searching for safety, or is the system finally starting to crack? And here's where it gets even more intense. The next moves could change everything. New laws are being proposed, federal power is expanding, and thousands of immigrant families are now caught in the middle of a fight they did not create. What happens next won't just affect migrants. It will affect schools, hospitals, neighborhoods, airports, taxes, and public safety across the entire city. So in this video, we're breaking down the 10 biggest updates of 2026 and why the real breaking point may still be ahead. Number 1. Washington has directly threatened New York's sanctuary city status. What happens when the federal government stops warning and starts threatening action? That is exactly where New York finds itself in 2026. For years, the city's sanctuary city stance has been one of its most defining political promises, a message to immigrants that local institutions would not simply become an extension of federal immigration enforcement. But now, Washington is turning up the pressure in a way that feels far more serious than political talk. The message is becoming clear. If cities like New York refuse to fully cooperate, they could face consequences that go far beyond headlines and speeches. And that is what makes this moment so explosive. This is no longer just a disagreement over policy. It is a direct power struggle between the federal government and one of America's most influential cities. What makes this even more dramatic is the scale of what is being threatened. We are talking about possible punishment aimed at the very systems that keep New York moving: its airports, its funding, its public services, and its ability to govern itself. That means this fight is not only about undocumented migrants or asylum seekers anymore. It could affect tourists landing at JFK, families worried about safety, businesses relying on international travel, and communities already stretched by years of pressure. When Washington threatens sanctuary policies, it is really threatening the entire structure around them. And suddenly, millions of people who never thought immigration policy touched their daily lives may start feeling the effects in ways they cannot ignore. That is why this is such a critical first update in the story. New York is being forced to defend more than a policy. It is being forced to defend its identity. Can the city hold the line under federal pressure, or will it be pushed into compromise? Because if Washington succeeds here, it could set a powerful example for what happens next in other sanctuary cities across America. And that raises the tension even higher. This is not just New York's battle anymore. It is the opening shot in a much bigger national confrontation, and the outcome could shape immigration policy for the rest of 2026 and beyond. Number 2. ICE activity at airports is already affecting New Yorkers. What if the immigration fight no longer starts at the border, but at the airport gate? That is the unsettling reality New York is now facing in 2026. Airports are supposed to feel like places of movement, connection, and opportunity. People arriving for work, family, safety, or a fresh start. But now, for many immigrants, those same spaces are starting to feel tense, uncertain, and deeply intimidating. The fear is no longer limited to shelters or courtrooms. It is showing up in terminals, security lines, and arrival halls, where the simple act of traveling can suddenly turn into a moment of panic. And in a city like New York, where international travel is part of daily life, that change carries enormous emotional and political weight. What makes this development so powerful is that airports are not some distant corner of the system. They are one of the most visible front doors to the city itself. When immigration enforcement becomes more active in these places, the message spreads fast through immigrant communities. No space feels fully safe anymore. Families begin to worry before a loved one lands. Travelers start second-guessing trips they once considered normal. Even legal residents and mixed-status families can feel a wave of anxiety, because confusion and fear do not stay neatly contained once enforcement becomes more aggressive. The airport becomes more than a travel hub. It becomes becomes a symbol of pressure, uncertainty, and control. That is why this update matters so much in the bigger story. New York's immigration crisis is no longer just about where people sleep or how much the city spends. It is about how deeply enforcement is entering everyday life. When fear reaches airports, it reaches workers, students, tourists, parents, and entire neighborhoods connected to those journeys. And that changes the mood of the city. What used to feel like movement and possibility can suddenly feel like risk. That is the deeper warning here. In 2026, the pressure is spreading, and New Yorkers are starting to feel it in places they never expected. Number 3, ICE arrests in New York have surged. What does it mean when immigration arrests suddenly start rising again in a city already under pressure? It means the crisis is no longer sitting quietly in the background. It is moving closer to people's daily lives. In 2026, the surge in ICE arrests has added a new layer of fear across New York, especially in immigrant neighborhoods where uncertainty is already part of everyday life. This is not just about numbers on a report. It is about parents leaving home worried they may not come back by dinner, workers feeling watched on the way to their jobs, and families living with the constant tension of what could happen next. The emotional weight of enforcement is becoming just as powerful as the political debate itself. What makes this even more intense is how quickly that fear can spread. Once reports of increased arrests begin circulating, entire communities start changing their behavior. People skip appointments, avoid public places, cancel travel, and become more hesitant to ask for help even when they need it most. Schools, workplaces, hospitals, and neighborhood businesses all begin to feel the pressure. A rise in arrests does not stay limited to those being targeted. It sends a chilling message to everyone around them. And in a city as connected and diverse as New York, that kind of fear moves fast. It creates silence where there should be trust, hesitation where there should be normal life, and anxiety where there should be stability. That is why this update matters so much in 2026. The immigration battle is no longer only about policy announcements or courtroom arguments. It is happening in real time, in real neighborhoods, with real consequences for families trying to survive and stay together. When arrests surge, the entire atmosphere changes. The city starts to feel heavier, more divided, and more uncertain. And that leads to the bigger question hanging over New York right now. If enforcement keeps rising, how long can communities keep functioning under this level of fear before the social damage becomes impossible to ignore? Number 4, Haitian TPS became one of New York's biggest immigration flashpoints. What happens when thousands of people who built their lives around legal protection suddenly face the possibility of losing it? That is exactly why Haitian TPS has become one of the most explosive immigration stories in New York in 2026. For many families, this is not some distant legal argument happening in a courtroom. It is a direct threat to their jobs, their homes, their children's future, and their sense of safety in the city they now call home. People who believed they had at least some temporary stability are now being pulled back into uncertainty. And that kind of fear hits differently because it does not just affect new arrivals, it affects people who have already planted roots and tried to move forward. What makes this crisis even more emotional is that Haitian communities in New York are deeply connected to the city's everyday life. They are workers, parents, neighbors, church members, small business owners, and caregivers. So when TPS protections come under threat, the impact spreads far beyond immigration paperwork. Families begin asking painful questions. Will they lose the right to work? Will they face deportation? Will their children be forced to live in fear? A policy shift on paper can turn into panic inside entire neighborhoods. And because so many people depend on that legal protection to keep their lives standing, the issue becomes far more than political. It becomes personal, immediate, and deeply human. That is why this update is such a major warning sign for New York in 2026. The city is no longer only dealing with incoming migrants and shelter pressure. It is also facing a future where established immigrant communities could be thrown back into crisis almost overnight. If protections like TPS start disappearing, New York may see a second wave of instability, not at the border but inside homes, schools, and workplaces already woven into the city. And that makes the entire immigration battle even more dangerous, because now the fear is not just about arriving. It is about suddenly losing everything after you thought you were finally safe. Number 5, Governor Hochul responded with an anti-collusion proposal. What happens when a state decides it will no longer quietly assist federal immigration crackdown? That is the message behind Governor Hochul's response in 2026. 2026. Instead of simply reacting with speeches and public criticism, New York moved toward a much more direct line of defense, limiting how much local police and jails can be used to support federal civil immigration enforcement. That may sound technical at first, but its meaning is huge. It tells immigrant communities that the state is trying to draw a hard boundary between local public safety and federal deportation efforts. And in a year filled with fear, raids, and rising tension, that kind of move sends a very powerful signal. What makes this proposal so important is that it goes straight to the heart of how immigration enforcement actually works on the ground. Federal agencies often depend on local systems, local information, and local cooperation to expand their reach. So when a state tries to cut off that support, it changes the entire balance of power. This is not just about policy language. It is about whether New York's own institutions will help fuel the fear spreading through immigrant neighborhoods, or whether they will hold the line. For many families, that difference matters deeply. It can shape how safe they feel calling the police, showing up to court, or simply living day to day without feeling hunted by overlapping systems. That is why this update matters so much in the story of 2026. New York is no longer just defending migrants with words. It is trying to build legal and political barriers against deeper federal intrusion. And that raises the stakes even more, because once a state openly resists, the confrontation becomes bigger, louder, and harder to control. This is no longer only about migrants seeking shelter. It is about who truly governs New York streets, jails, and public institutions. And as this battle deepens, the city and the state are being pulled into an even more dramatic question. Can local power really shield immigrant communities, or will federal pressure eventually break through anyway? If this story hit you hard, don't just scroll away. Drop a comment with the one update that shocked you most, or tell us, can New York still handle this crisis, or has the breaking point already arrived? And if you truly value the effort we put into bringing you deeply researched videos like this, please subscribe to the channel. It's just one click for you, but for us, it means everything and helps us keep making more powerful content. Number 6. New York also moved to shield schools, hospitals, and homes. What happens when the immigration battle moves into the most personal spaces of everyday life? That is exactly why this 2026 development feels so serious. New York is no longer only fighting over shelters, borders, or city budgets. Now the focus is shifting toward places that people instinctively see as safe: schools, hospitals, houses of worship, and even homes. When those spaces become part of the immigration debate, the fear becomes much more intimate. Parents start wondering if dropping a child at school could come with risk. Sick people may hesitate before going to a hospital. Families begin to feel that even private spaces are no longer completely protected. And once that feeling spreads, the emotional damage can be enormous. What makes this update so powerful is that these are not just buildings. They are the places where trust is supposed to exist. A school is where children are meant to feel secure. A hospital is where people go when they are vulnerable. A home is where a family should be able to close the door and breathe. So when New York pushes to create stronger legal barriers around those spaces, it is doing more than adjusting policy. It is trying to defend the last line of normal life for immigrant communities. Because without those protections, fear does not stay outside in the streets. It walks into classrooms, emergency rooms, prayer spaces, and living rooms, turning ordinary moments into sources of stress and silence. That is why this moment matters so much in the larger story of 2026. New York understands that once fear enters these sensitive places, the consequences can spread far beyond immigration itself. Children learn anxiety, families avoid care, communities lose trust, and the city becomes harder to hold together. So this is not just about legal language. It is about whether New York can preserve basic spaces of dignity and safety while federal pressure keeps rising. And that makes the stakes even higher, because if these protections fail, the immigration crisis will no longer feel like a political fight happening somewhere else. It will feel like it has entered the heart of everyday life itself. Number 7. The state is openly clashing with federal enforcement tactics. What happens when tension turns into open confrontation? That is where New York finds itself now. In 2026, the immigration crisis is no longer just a policy disagreement between different levels of government. It has become a direct and increasingly hostile clash over power, authority, and control. The state is pushing back harder, the federal government is pressing forward more aggressively, and immigrant communities are trapped in the middle of that collision. What once looked like a debate over rules now feels like a battle over who gets to decide how far enforcement can go. And the more public this fight becomes, the more unstable the entire situation starts to feel. What makes this moment so dramatic is that both sides are no longer hiding their intentions. Federal officials are signaling that they are ready to expand pressure, while New York leaders are making it clear they see some of those tactics as dangerous, excessive, or even unlawful. That kind of language changes everything. It tells the public that this is not a quiet bureaucratic disagreement happening behind closed doors. It is an active conflict with real consequences for detention, deportation, local policing, and community trust. Once that line is crossed, the fear grows faster, because people begin to sense that the system itself is becoming more unpredictable. And when enforcement becomes unpredictable, families start living in a state of permanent tension. That is why this update matters so much in the bigger story of 2026. New York is no longer simply trying to manage a migrant crisis. It is now fighting to define the limits of federal power inside its own borders. And that makes the stakes even higher, because when state and federal authorities openly collide, the result is rarely calm. It creates confusion, legal battles, public anger, and deeper anxiety in neighborhoods already under pressure. The real danger is that this conflict may keep escalating until every new move feels more aggressive than the last. And if that happens, New York will not just be dealing with an immigration crisis anymore. It will be facing a full-scale political and social showdown with no easy exit. Number 8. The shelter crisis is easing in raw numbers but not in political risk. At first glance, this sounds like good news. Fewer migrants in shelters should mean less pressure, less chaos, and a chance for New York to breathe again. But in 2026, that drop in numbers does not mean the crisis is over. It simply means the crisis is changing shape. The emergency phase of packed shelters and non-stop arrivals may be slowing, but now the city is entering a far more complicated stage, one driven by money, legal status, long-term housing, and public frustration. The visible pressure may be easing, but the deeper political pressure is still building. What makes this so important is that lower shelter numbers can create a false sense of relief. Leaders may claim progress, but many of the hardest questions remain unanswered. Where will people go next? How will they work legally, find stable housing, or support their families? And who will keep paying for the systems built during the height of the crisis? When the headlines calm down, the hidden problems often become more dangerous. They move out of emergency centers and into neighborhoods, budgets, and already strained public services. That is when the issue becomes less dramatic on camera, but more difficult in real life. That is why this update matters so much. New York is not leaving the crisis behind. It is stepping into a new chapter where the challenge is no longer just sheltering people, but absorbing them into a city already under pressure. And that stage could be even more politically explosive, because it forces leaders to answer the one question they have tried to avoid. What does a long-term solution actually look like? Number 9. The city is trying to shut down the last emergency-era shelter model. The biggest sign that New York is entering a new phase is this. The city is trying to move away from the emergency shelter system that defined the height of the migrant crisis. On the surface, that sounds like a sign of recovery. Fewer emergency sites should mean less chaos, less strain, and a more stable approach. But this shift also raises a much more uncomfortable question. What happens to the people still depending on those temporary spaces once the emergency model disappears? Closing shelters may reduce the image of crisis, but it does not automatically solve the human reality underneath it. That is what makes this moment so sensitive. Emergency shelters were never meant to be a permanent answer, but for thousands of people, they became the only thing standing between survival and complete instability. Now the city wants to move people into a more standard system, one that looks cleaner, more controlled, and more legally sustainable. But transitions like this are rarely simple. Families can get lost in the process, support systems can weaken, and the emotional uncertainty can grow even when officials say conditions are improving. What looks organized on paper can still feel deeply unsettling for the people living through it. That is why this update matters so much in 2026. New York is trying to close the chapter of visible emergency, but the deeper struggle is far from over. The crisis is not disappearing, it is being reorganized. And that can be just as politically dangerous, because once the last emergency shelter model fades, the city loses one more excuse for temporary action. From that point forward, New Yorkers will demand something much harder: a real long-term plan. Number 10. City Hall is rebuilding immigrant policy around long-term defense and services. New York is now realizing that this crisis cannot be managed month to month forever. That is why City Hall is starting to rebuild its immigration strategy around something much bigger than emergency response: long-term protection, legal support, and basic stability. In other words, the city is trying to prepare for a future where immigration pressure does not suddenly disappear, but becomes a lasting part of urban life. That shift matters because it shows New York understands the old model is no longer enough. Shelters, short-term fixes, and reactive spending may buy time, but they do not create security. What the city needs now is a system that can protect people while also holding the city together. What makes this development so important is that services are no longer just about compassion. They are becoming a form of defense. Legal help, outreach programs, hotlines, language access, and community support can determine whether immigrant families stay informed, protected, and connected, or fall deeper into fear and confusion. When a city invests in these systems, it is not just helping migrants survive. It is trying to prevent panic, disorder, and long-term social damage. That is a very different phase of the story. The fight is no longer only about responding to arrivals. It is about building the kind of structure that can survive continued pressure from Washington, rising enforcement, and growing political backlash. That is why this final update may be one of the most important of all. New York is trying to move from chaos to strategy. But whether that strategy works will decide what 2026 really becomes: a turning point or a warning. Because if the city cannot build a stronger long-term system now, the next wave of pressure may hit even harder than the last. So where does all of this leave New York in 2026? It leaves the city standing in the middle of a storm that is no longer just about migrants arriving at shelters. It is now about power, pressure, and the future of the city itself. What started as a humanitarian emergency has grown into something far more complex: a battle over federal authority, local resistance, public resources, and the limits of compassion in one of the world's most important cities. And that is why this moment feels so heavy. New York is not just trying to absorb a crisis. It is trying to survive a transformation. The biggest warning sign is that every part of the system is now being tested at once. Shelters may be less crowded, but fear is spreading through neighborhoods. Enforcement is rising, political clashes are growing sharper, and families who thought they had some stability are once again facing uncertainty. Schools, hospitals, airports, courts, and city services are all being pulled into the same struggle. This is what a true breaking point looks like. Not one dramatic collapse, but a slow and painful pressure building across every layer of daily life. And the most unsettling part is that the hardest chapter may still be ahead. Because in the end, the real question is no longer whether New York can handle one more wave of arrivals. The real question is whether it can build a system strong enough, fair enough, and stable enough to hold together under permanent immigration pressure. What happens next will shape not only the lives of immigrant families, but the identity of New York itself. Will this city remain a symbol of refuge? Or will it become a warning to every other sanctuary city in America? That answer is still being written right now.